Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Bonnie Bright, and I am a soul-centered psychologist and an archetypal pattern analyst, and also a soul-centered coach and mentor. And I'm here with Dr. Christophe Morin, who is going to introduce himself.
Thank you, Bonnie. I'm delighted to be here with you to bring the perspective of a media psychologist, but also a neuroscientist. I have spent 25 years or so doing research to really understand and decode the way our behavior is often programmed and automated by our nervous system.
Well, it's great because today we are going to be talking about two topics which actually come together as one, and that is chaos and consciousness. So I'm sure that you'll have a lot to say about the neuroscientific perspective. Let's start out by talking about chaos, because this is something that everybody is pretty familiar with, whether it's in your own personal life or in the world around us. There's a lot going on out there. Chaos is generally defined as orderless confusion. And so that is obviously a state that most of us do not tolerate very well. The ego part of us wants to know what's going on, and it definitely does not like the unknown. And so often I find that in states of chaos, particularly when I work with clients who are feeling that in their lives, that they really have a lot of resistance to being able to move into more healthy states of being. And so what we want to talk about today is perhaps the ability to move from chaos into greater consciousness and the role that chaos plays in our ability to be conscious.
So from the perspective of the brain, chaos is a state that tends to burn a lot of extra energy. And we don't have one brain. I carry my brain always with me. We actually happen to have two brains, and those two brains are responsible for our survival. And the primal brain, as it is called, is essentially mostly interested in conserving energy. And so what happens is a state of chaos tends to freeze a number of cognitive functions because there's just not enough oxygen, there's just not enough glucose to feed the beast, so to speak, and therefore will freeze people in situations where they feel stuck or excessively tired. That's obviously a neurobiological perspective, but if you take that into what you understand, Bonnie, that may become an important piece of our dialogue.
Well, as you know, I like to look at things from a soul-centered perspective. In the word psychology, the word psyche actually means soul in Greek. And so it's a really important aspect of particularly what I call soul-centered psychologies, that is Jungian psychology, depth psychology, which is commonly associated with Jungian, although I think that it encompasses quite a bit more than that. And then also transpersonal psychology and archetypal psychology. So if you're familiar with any of these, you will know that each one of these are actually based on the idea of studying the unconscious, or what is unconscious for all of us, whether it's on a personal level, things that have happened in our biographical lives, things that we have either repressed or suppressed, to make them unconscious so that we don't have to deal with the fallout or the chaos, actually, that the pain or the difficulties or the conflict that arises from some of the challenges that we face when we're very young. And of course, our ego then develops these coping mechanisms or ways of helping us to navigate so that we don't feel that pain in the same way that we would if we were not able to repress it, or come up with some of these ways to distract ourselves, or to find ways that we can feel safe and also to feel seen or to earn someone's love. And so the word psyche, meaning soul, indicates technically that every psychology is a soul-centered psychology. And that's one reason that I really love to use the term, because it indicates something that is bigger than us, bigger than our ego self. In fact, there's a lot of different words that you could substitute for the word soul: the universe. You could use the word God, you could use Great Spirit. And so the idea of soul is not necessarily religious, but it definitely has a spiritual connotation, in the sense that there's something sacred about it. And of course, in our Western society, we have really, really grown away from this idea of things being sacred. Of course, in indigenous societies and our ancestral past, most of the people were embedded in a state of divinity. They were living in nature. They followed the seasons, and they saw how things evolved and changed, and they saw cycles of life and death, and they respected and held a sense of awe for nature. Things like eclipses were known to be coming from a divine source. And so what we're talking about really is something that is bigger than our ego selves. Our ego selves are what navigates, but our soul self is what we can tap into in order to bring ourselves into a state of awe and the sacred. And that is where we can begin to make sense of the chaos and then start to apply that in our lives. So new states of joy, of creativity, and of freedom to live our lives in new ways. And also, by the way to manifest what we want in our lives. So anybody who's listening to this who might be experiencing depression or has had some experiences with neuroticism or disorders of any kind, or someone who just doesn't feel like they can get out of bed, or someone who is having a really rough time in relationships, all of this can feel very chaotic. But if we can step aside from the ego and see the big picture, what we can understand is that the chaos is actually more like an initiation. It's an initiatory process that if we can just figure out how to survive it and how to start making some sense of it, then we can really gain some incredible lessons and immense growth about the things that we are having to deal with. And our ego state, you can look at this as almost an add-on on top of our soul. And it is the part of ourselves that actually drives our actions and helps us to navigate through life. But of course, the challenge with the ego is that it is constantly trying to do two things. One is to help us feel safe, and the other one is to help us feel seen and therefore loved and accepted by those that we needed. And when we're young kids, we have to have that ego because it's really important to learn how to cope with whatever challenges we are faced with in our very young little lives. I know you know something about how the fact that our rational brain is not quite developed until we are almost 25 years old. And so our ego kind of takes the place of that rational brain and allows us to be able to find ways to cope with whatever challenges we're facing. And often what we would describe as chaos is what the ego is trying to solve. Now, on the other hand, the part of ourselves that is that infinite part that Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychiatrist, talked about, that is underlying everything, that cannot be hurt, cannot be wounded, cannot be angered or frustrated, or cannot feel necessarily sad. That is the part of ourselves that we want to tap into in order to be able to bring ourselves into higher states of consciousness and understanding. And I always like to use this as an example with my own clients. That is, our ego can typically see something like this, but when we can bring the soul into it, we can start to see something like this. There's so much more in our lives that is going on than what we have the capacity to even begin to understand until we start to lift the lid on some of our own coping mechanisms, most of them unconscious, by the way.
So I'll piggyback on what you just described. Obviously, the notion of ego is rarely discussed or even considered in neuroscientific circle, but most recently, especially with research on the effect of psychedelics on the brain, we do understand that one of the function and benefit of psychedelic research is that we can turn down the ego by turning down the activity of what is called the default mode network. So think of the default mode network as connections in the brain that are essentially reserved and used by the ego. And so neuroscientists have been able to confirm the existence of this force called the ego by witnessing how much energy it actually takes for the brain to make it work. And that energy can be, in a way, freed to bypass that ego and maybe raise consciousness, or at least create states that are healing states, or states where we can use that extra energy for good, so to speak.
Yes, and it's interesting you say that because I mentioned Jung a few moments ago, and one thing that he really focused on was this idea that a lot of indigenous societies believe in, and that is the concept of soul loss. And the way that he looked at soul loss was almost as if a part of ourselves is broken away or splits off, and in indigenous societies is taken off to what is often looked at as the underworld. And we can certainly see how when we are experiencing traumas in our life or challenges that we just don't know what to do about, when we fall into some of those states that are very disturbing or unhealthy, when we develop disorders or neuroticism around certain things, we would say perhaps that it is a result of this soul loss. And chaos can certainly be a big indicator of soul loss, because when we are experiencing that chaos, we do not have the capacity to operate in a functional manner. And that is what you were just referring to with the default mode network. So what we want to do is to be able to start to make some sense out of the chaos in order to be able then to start making decisions and choosing states of being that will actually serve us better. And I do just want to say that this doesn't always happen overnight, but it certainly can be done by accessing what we call non-ordinary states of consciousness. You just mentioned psychedelic research a few moments ago. And of course, that is one of those non-ordinary states of consciousness that we are discussing, being that it is not our regular ego state that gets us through life. It is actually, as you said, allowing the ego to step aside and for us to be able to access more of the totality of who we really are. And once we can do that, then we can begin to tap back into the energy that we need, the life force that we need, the intelligence, and in fact, the self-regulating function that is inherent in every human being in order to be able to correct our path, so to speak.
Two other things, and this is really quite remarkable, related to what you just said. Not only can we now understand the benefit of turning down the default mode network, one being that the ego, particularly in a state of chaos, is never going to be able to figure out what is going on. But the inner intelligence that we have seems to reside below our level of consciousness, below the ego. And so by dropping into non-ordinary states of consciousness, not only do we suspend the ego, but we can also accelerate an incredible gift of nature or the divine called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is a mechanism that gives us the capacity to rewrite or reform certain pathways. And when you find yourself in a state of chaos, typically you're going to start to either numb yourself or go into maladaptive behaviors such as addictions or depression or anxiety. So our brain has that capacity to rewire itself as long as it has the energy, it has the room effectively to attend to that priority, and then neuroplasticity can kick in.
Yes, one of my favorite quotes of Jung's is, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos, and in all disorder, a secret order." So that brings me back to this whole idea of self-regulation, of being able to put ourselves into these states where we have that spaciousness to allow that self-regulation, that self-organization to begin to do its magic and to work on us. And I do want to say that these states of chaos can be critically important to our capacity to be able to evolve and to grow. In fact, a lot of people who are artists or who make music or writers or anybody who is pursuing a passion in the arts of some kind can really testify to the fact that sometimes when our lives are the most chaotic is when the best of our work comes out of us. And I do believe that it is a function of us being able to go into the chaos and then to allow that self-organizing function to kick in. And of course, Jung loved the study of alchemy. He could really see how this old tradition of turning lead into gold, as the alchemists were trying to do, as a metaphor for us being able to do our own personal psycho-spiritual work. And that is to start to allow what is the gold in our own personality, in our own being, the soul part of ourselves, in other words, to emerge. And so anytime that we enter into one of those non-ordinary states of consciousness, whether it's through breath work or through meditation or through ecstatic dance or yoga or being in our body in some way, shamanic journeying, some people will be familiar with that. anytime that we can access those kinds of states and begin to create that spaciousness around us, then we can begin to allow whatever was in that chaos to emerge in a way that we can take advantage of that and use it then to evolve into a higher state of consciousness.
So from what you just shared, it's obvious that there is this intimate relationship between chaos and consciousness, and that traditional views of chaos suggest that it's unproductive, wasteful, when in fact you and I have come to believe with different perspective that there is a gift inside that level of complexity, or some other people refer as entropy. So what is consciousness and how do we see consciousness? So do you want to take a first pass at that?
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot there. But I will just say that for me, consciousness is really being able to get an understanding of what was formerly unconscious for us. That is a huge catalyst to our own consciousness. And of course, consciousness, we might use it interchangeably with awareness, but that awareness has to be around how our psyche is functioning, how we are in relationship with everything in our lives, essentially, not just other people, although other people is a huge piece of that, but also how are we in relationship with nature? How are we in relationship with our consumer culture? How are we in relationship with the violence and the wars that are happening at this point in the planet? All of those relationships, whether we look at them as chaotic or not chaotic, are opportunities or portals to that greater awareness about ourselves and our own consciousness.
Beautiful. Of course, again, as my research is focused primarily on measuring consciousness, reporting the presence of more or less consciousness, I've come to really appreciate the multiple definitions. And you shared, of course, words that often become synonyms like being awake or being alert or being able to attend to certain events. I have come to believe that consciousness is really energy that is giving us the capacity as humans to more or less observe our states. And so you can imagine that there is a primal consciousness where we barely know that we have an ego, where we, however, understand that we may be at risk of being eaten alive by another animal. So that would be primal consciousness, limited to attending to those priorities that basically save us. Then you have higher level of consciousness, and some that are possible because of non-ordinary states of consciousness, where we have this ability all of a sudden to actually see what we could not see before. So I've called that meta consciousness or hyper consciousness. And I've come to believe as a researcher that life is a much easier experience when we can actually observe and possibly report or share our experience. So it might be more limiting in some way in my world of neuroscience, but I find that there is more and more ability now to overlap definitions that are brought by scientists, particularly in neuroscience, and definitions that are brought by psychologists like you.
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing that in, because, of course, one thing that we are doing just by talking about consciousness itself is we are bringing language to it. And by bringing language to it, it helps us to be able to parse what that is and to be able to start integrating that and applying it to our lives. And one thing I am conscious of is that the root word of consciousness, actually conscire, comes from the Latin, which means to know. And so this brings me back to this whole idea that we are driven by what is unconscious for us. All of our lives, we have developed these responses to things, reactivities to things often, but it's often happening below the surface of our awareness. And so that is what Jung would call the unconscious. So Jungian psychology, depth psychology, soul-centered psychologies are known as the study of the unconscious. But how do you study the unconscious? It's kind of studying what we don't know that we don't know, right? So again, that is why using or tapping into these non-ordinary states of consciousness, experiential activities that can actually allow us to access that something bigger, that is an inherent ordering function. If you look at quantum physics, you can understand that we are an individual part of consciousness, but also holograms. We are the universe at the same time. quantum theory tells us that consciousness, once it becomes condensed and condensed and condensed, it becomes matter. But of course, matter is only 4% of what we see or know in the known universe. And what is that other 96%? Well, I would offer that if that is consciousness, pure consciousness, then once we can tap into that unconscious and start to bring these tools and techniques and make what is unconscious conscious, then we can start to get a little bit of that white space in the default mode network that you were talking about. We can then see and catch ourselves when we start to go into a pattern that is perhaps not very healthy for us because our ego is terrified of what is happening in the chaos. And we can then start in that little bit of white space to be able to make different decisions about how we want to live our lives, about how we want to be in relationship with people or things, about what we want to manifest in our lives. So there's an enormous implication here about gaining that higher consciousness that can translate directly and definitely into us being able to live lives of greater joy, greater creativity, greater happiness, greater freedom, to be sure.
I love that way to end our conversation, and that is, while many of the concepts that we've talked about today are pretty abstract, the truth is when you decide at any level to improve your consciousness, there are very, very easy ways to do it. One is definitely to learn a topic, let's say. Another could be to do some breath work or to meditate or yoga. So we have, you and I, tested and experienced many of those modalities, and they all, it seems, almost magically raise consciousness and give us this lift that we need to see ourselves, to look at the positive and the less positive aspects of our behavior, to see what triggers reaction, sometimes annoyance or anger. You call that the coping mechanisms. Those, many of them are not conscious. So how do we start rewiring what we cannot see? It's a little bit, how do we know we are speeding if we don't have a dashboard, right? We may think, well, I'm going at the speed that I can, right? So all of that is really the gift of our conversation, and that is it's become more and more approachable and easier to learn the ways we can to improve our consciousness.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I just want to thank you, Christophe, for your time today, and more to come, because together we will be offering a free webinar on May 9th. And that webinar will be available for anybody to attend or to listen to later. Anyone who's interested in achieving higher states of consciousness and working through some of these limiting patterns and beliefs that we have gained over the course of our lives by our ego just trying to help us feel safe or to be seen. And then we will talk about ways that we can tap into more of that creativity and joy. And of course, all of this is in advance of some upcoming retreats that we will be offering on the Big Island of Hawaii. So if you're interested in that, I hope that you will tune in.
Thank you, Bonnie, for inviting me to this fascinating conversation.